Question 1. The audit findings indicate a pattern of incomplete Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) checks being performed for new client onboardings, potentially exposing the firm to regulatory scrutiny under the Bank Secrecy Act. Management is pushing to onboard a high-value client quickly to meet quarterly revenue targets. Which of the following actions best upholds regulatory compliance and professional ethics? Option A. Complete all required KYC and AML due diligence procedures thoroughly before onboarding the new client, even if it delays the onboarding process and impacts short-term revenue targets. Option B. Proceed with onboarding the new client immediately to meet revenue targets and address the audit findings by implementing a retrospective review of all onboarded clients at a later date. Option C. Inform management that the audit findings necessitate a halt to all new client onboarding until a comprehensive review and remediation of the KYC/AML process is completed. Option D. Expedite the KYC and AML process for the new client by performing only the most critical checks and documenting that the remaining steps will be completed post-onboarding. Correct answer is A. Complete all required KYC and AML due diligence procedures thoroughly before onboarding the new client, even if it delays the onboarding process and impacts short-term revenue targets. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate business needs and the long-term imperative of regulatory compliance. The pressure to onboard a new client quickly, coupled with the potential for lost revenue if the process is delayed, creates a temptation to bypass or expedite critical compliance steps. This requires careful judgment to balance business objectives with legal and ethical obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves diligently completing all required Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) checks before onboarding, represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the core principles of regulatory compliance. Specifically, it adheres to the Bank Secrecy Act (BSA) and its implementing regulations, which mandate robust customer due diligence to prevent financial crimes. This proactive stance mitigates legal risk, reputational damage, and potential penalties for the firm and its employees. It demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and responsible business operations. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with onboarding without completing all KYC/AML checks, despite the audit findings, represents a direct violation of the BSA and its associated regulations. This failure to conduct adequate due diligence exposes the firm to significant risks, including facilitating money laundering or terrorist financing, which can result in severe civil and criminal penalties. Ethically, it signifies a disregard for the firm's responsibility to maintain the integrity of the financial system. Attempting to expedite the KYC/AML process by performing superficial checks or relying on incomplete information is also a regulatory failure. While appearing to address the issue, it falls short of the reasonable diligence standard required by the BSA. This approach is a form of regulatory arbitrage, seeking to appear compliant without actually fulfilling the spirit or letter of the law. It creates a false sense of security and leaves the firm vulnerable to the same risks as not performing the checks at all. Ignoring the audit findings and continuing with business as usual is the most egregious failure. This demonstrates a complete disregard for internal controls, audit processes, and regulatory requirements. It signals a culture that prioritizes short-term gains over long-term compliance and ethical conduct, leading to potentially catastrophic legal and financial consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should first acknowledge the seriousness of the audit findings and the potential regulatory implications. They should then consult the firm's internal compliance policies and procedures, which are designed to reflect relevant regulations like the BSA. The decision-making process should prioritize adherence to these policies and the underlying regulations. If there is ambiguity or pressure to deviate, escalating the issue to the compliance department or legal counsel is crucial. The ultimate goal is to ensure that all actions taken are in full compliance with regulatory requirements, even if it means delaying business objectives. Question 2. Implementation of a comprehensive risk assessment framework at TriNet requires selecting the most effective methodology. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations for robust risk management and ethical business practices? Option A. A reactive approach where risk assessments are only conducted in response to actual incidents or breaches, rather than proactively identifying and evaluating potential threats. Option B, a hybrid approach that integrates qualitative methods, such as expert judgment and scenario planning, with quantitative methods, such as statistical analysis and historical data modeling, to provide a balanced and actionable understanding of potential risks. Option C, a strategy that prioritizes quantitative analysis, focusing solely on statistical models and historical data to measure risks, while disregarding less quantifiable but potentially significant qualitative risks. Option D, a methodology that exclusively utilizes qualitative assessments, relying heavily on expert opinions and brainstorming sessions to identify potential risk areas without quantifying their likelihood or impact. The correct answer is B, a hybrid approach that integrates qualitative methods, such as expert judgment and scenario planning, with quantitative methods, such as statistical analysis and historical data modeling, to provide a balanced and actionable understanding of potential risks. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment principles within the context of TriNet's operational environment, which likely involves managing a diverse client base with varying risk profiles. The challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate and effective risk assessment methodology that aligns with regulatory expectations and business objectives, without overrelying on a single, potentially inadequate, approach. Careful judgment is required to balance comprehensiveness with practicality and to ensure that the chosen method provides actionable insights for risk mitigation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it advocates for a multifaceted risk assessment strategy. This involves combining qualitative and quantitative methods to gain a holistic view of potential risks. Qualitative methods, such as expert judgment and scenario analysis, are crucial for identifying emerging or complex risks that might not be easily quantifiable. Quantitative methods, like statistical modeling and historical data analysis, provide objective measures of risk likelihood and impact, enabling prioritization and resource allocation. This integrated approach ensures that all significant risks are considered, from strategic and operational to financial and compliance risks, thereby fulfilling regulatory expectations for robust risk management frameworks and promoting ethical business conduct by proactively addressing potential harm to clients and the company. Incorrect approaches analysis, relying solely on qualitative assessments, while useful for identifying broad categories of risk, fails to provide the objective data needed for effective prioritization and resource allocation. This can lead to an underestimation of the likelihood or impact of certain risks, potentially violating regulatory requirements for a comprehensive risk management program that demands measurable risk evaluation. Focusing exclusively on quantitative analysis, though providing objective data, may overlook subtle or emerging risks that are difficult to quantify. This narrow focus can result in a blind spot for qualitative risks, such as reputational damage or complex compliance issues, leading to potential regulatory noncompliance and ethical lapses by failing to adequately protect stakeholders. Adopting a purely reactive approach, where risk assessment is only conducted after an incident occurs, is fundamentally flawed. This approach is not only inefficient, but also demonstrably negligent from a regulatory standpoint, as it fails to meet the proactive risk identification and mitigation requirements mandated by most compliance frameworks. It also represents a significant ethical failure, as it prioritizes damage control over the prevention of harm. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with understanding the specific regulatory landscape and the organization's risk appetite. This involves identifying the types of risks relevant to the business, e.g., operational, financial, compliance, strategic. Subsequently, they should evaluate various risk assessment methodologies, considering their strengths and weaknesses in relation to the identified risks and regulatory requirements. The most effective approach is often a hybrid one, combining qualitative and quantitative techniques to ensure both breadth and depth in risk identification and analysis. This process should be iterative, with regular reviews and updates to the risk assessment to account for changes in the business environment and emerging threats. Question 3. Quality control measures reveal a pattern of recurring minor operational disruptions within TriNet's client onboarding process. These disruptions, while not currently causing significant financial loss, have the potential to escalate and impact client satisfaction and regulatory compliance if left unaddressed. Which of the following approaches best aligns with a proactive and compliant risk management strategy for TriNet? Option A. Conduct a cost-benefit analysis to determine the minimum level of risk mitigation necessary to avoid immediate regulatory scrutiny, prioritizing cost savings. Option B. Implement a comprehensive risk assessment framework to identify potential vulnerabilities in the onboarding process, analyze their likelihood and impact, and develop preventative controls and contingency plans. Option C. Focus on resolving each minor disruption as it arises, documenting the immediate fix, and assuming that addressing individual issues will prevent larger problems. Option D. Allocate resources to address only those disruptions that have already resulted in client complaints or financial penalties. The correct answer is B. Implement a comprehensive risk assessment framework to identify potential vulnerabilities in the onboarding process, analyze their likelihood and impact, and develop preventative controls and contingency plans. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment principles within the context of TriNet's operational environment, specifically concerning the identification and mitigation of potential compliance and operational risks. The challenge lies in distinguishing between proactive risk identification and reactive problem solving, ensuring that the chosen approach aligns with regulatory expectations for robust risk management frameworks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it emphasizes a forward-looking, systematic process of identifying, analyzing, and evaluating potential risks before they materialize. This aligns with regulatory guidance that mandates a proactive approach to risk management, aiming to prevent adverse outcomes and ensure business continuity and compliance. By focusing on potential future events and their impact, this approach allows for the development of preventative controls and contingency plans, thereby minimizing potential financial, operational, and reputational damage. This proactive stance is crucial for maintaining client trust and adhering to the principles of sound governance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on addressing identified issues after they have occurred represents a failure to establish a comprehensive risk management framework. This reactive stance is often insufficient from a regulatory perspective, as it implies a lack of foresight and a failure to implement preventative measures. Such an approach can lead to repeated incidents, increased costs associated with remediation, and potential penalties for non-compliance if the identified issues stem from systemic weaknesses that were not proactively addressed. It demonstrates a deficiency in risk identification and assessment, which are foundational elements of any effective compliance program. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate cost savings over thorough risk assessment would be professionally unacceptable. Regulations often require that risk mitigation strategies be proportionate to the identified risks. Sacrificing a robust assessment for short-term financial gains can lead to underestimation of potential threats, inadequate controls, and ultimately, greater financial and reputational damage in the long run. This approach neglects the fiduciary duty to protect the organization and its clients from foreseeable harm. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach to risk management. This begins with clearly defining the scope of the assessment, identifying potential risks through various methods, e.g., brainstorming, historical data analysis, expert interviews, analyzing the likelihood and impact of each risk, evaluating the overall risk exposure, and then developing appropriate mitigation strategies. Regular review and monitoring of identified risks and the effectiveness of controls are also essential components. This systematic process ensures that risk management is an ongoing and integrated part of business operations, rather than an ad hoc response to problems. Question 4. Benchmark analysis indicates that the TriNet hiring assessment test is subject to various potential risks. Which of the following approaches to risk assessment best ensures the integrity and fairness of the assessment process while adhering to regulatory expectations? Option A. An approach that focuses exclusively on risks with the highest probability of occurrence, regardless of their potential severity. Option B. An approach that concentrates solely on identifying the most visible or frequently discussed risks within the industry. Option C. An approach that prioritizes only those risks that are easily measurable and have occurred in the past, without considering emerging threats. Option D. A comprehensive approach that identifies, analyzes, and prioritizes risks based on both their likelihood and potential impact, followed by the development of targeted mitigation strategies. The correct answer is D. A comprehensive approach that identifies, analyzes, and prioritizes risks based on both their likelihood and potential impact, followed by the development of targeted mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment beyond simple identification. The challenge lies in prioritizing risks based on their potential impact and likelihood, and then determining the most appropriate mitigation strategies within the TriNet hiring assessment test regulatory framework. Careful judgment is required to avoid over-reliance on one type of risk or underestimating the interconnectedness of various risk factors. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a systematic and comprehensive evaluation of potential risks. It acknowledges that not all risks are equal and that a tiered approach to mitigation is necessary. This aligns with the principles of prudent risk management, which emphasizes proactive identification, assessment, and control of risks to safeguard the integrity and effectiveness of the hiring process. Specifically, within the context of a hiring assessment, this approach ensures that the assessment itself is not compromised by external or internal factors that could lead to biased outcomes or inaccurate evaluations, thereby upholding fairness and compliance with relevant employment laws and assessment best practices. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the likelihood of a risk occurring, without considering its potential impact, fails to adequately prioritize resources. This could lead to significant effort being spent on minor risks while overlooking potentially catastrophic ones. This is a regulatory failure as it deviates from the principle of proportionate risk management, which mandates that resources are allocated based on the severity of potential harm. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes only the most obvious or easily quantifiable risks neglects less apparent but potentially more damaging risks, such as those related to data security or the ethical implications of assessment design. This is an ethical failure because it demonstrates a lack of due diligence in protecting candidate data and ensuring the fairness and validity of the assessment process. It also represents a potential regulatory failure if it leads to noncompliance with data privacy regulations or anti-discrimination laws. A third incorrect approach that relies on historical data without considering current or emerging trends is also professionally unacceptable. Risk landscapes evolve, and failing to adapt assessment strategies to new threats or changes in the candidate pool can render the assessment ineffective and potentially discriminatory. This is a failure in professional judgment and a deviation from best practices in risk management, which requires continuous monitoring and adaptation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly defining the scope of the risk assessment within the context of the TriNet hiring assessment test. 2. Employing a structured methodology for identifying potential risks across various categories, e.g., operational, technical, legal, ethical. 3. Evaluating each identified risk based on both its likelihood of occurrence and its potential impact. 4. Prioritizing risks based on this evaluation to focus mitigation efforts. 5. Developing and implementing appropriate control measures for high-priority risks. 6. Regularly reviewing and updating the risk assessment to account for changes in the environment or operational context. Question 5. The evaluation methodology shows a company is preparing to launch a new financial advisory service. Which of the following risk assessment approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations for prudent financial services operations in the U.S.? Option A. An assessment that prioritizes identifying only those risks that have a high probability of occurring, overlooking those with lower probability but potentially catastrophic impact. Option B. A cursory review of potential risks, focusing primarily on the anticipated revenue streams and assuming that existing operational controls are sufficient for the new service. Option C. A detailed assessment that identifies potential risks across operational, market, compliance, and reputational categories, quantifies their potential impact, and outlines specific mitigation strategies for each identified risk. Option D. An assessment that relies solely on the subjective opinions of the sales team regarding potential risks, without independent verification or structured analysis. The correct answer is C. A detailed assessment that identifies potential risks across operational, market, compliance, and reputational categories, quantifies their potential impact, and outlines specific mitigation strategies for each identified risk. Explanation: the evaluation methodology shows a company is undertaking a risk assessment for a new product launch. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing innovation with regulatory compliance and client protection. A thorough risk assessment is crucial to identify potential pitfalls, from operational failures to reputational damage and legal liabilities. The challenge lies in anticipating unforeseen issues and developing robust mitigation strategies without stifling business growth. The correct approach involves a comprehensive, multifaceted risk assessment that considers both qualitative and quantitative factors. This includes identifying all potential risks across various categories, e.g., market, operational, financial, compliance, assessing their likelihood and potential impact, and then developing appropriate control measures. This aligns with best professional practices and regulatory expectations, which mandate proactive risk management to safeguard stakeholders and maintain market integrity. For instance, under U.S. regulations, entities are expected to have robust risk management frameworks in place to prevent fraud, ensure data privacy, and comply with industry-specific rules. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the potential financial gains of the new product, without adequately assessing the associated risks. This demonstrates a failure to adhere to the principle of prudent risk management, which is a cornerstone of regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial assessment, perhaps by only considering obvious risks and neglecting less apparent but potentially severe ones, such as cybersecurity vulnerabilities or reputational damage from poor customer service. This oversight can lead to significant financial losses, regulatory penalties, and erosion of client trust. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty to act in the best interests of the company and its clients. A third incorrect approach might be to rely entirely on historical data without considering how the new product's unique characteristics might introduce novel risks. This fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of business and the need for forward-looking risk analysis. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk management framework. This typically includes risk identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk treatment, and risk monitoring. Professionals should engage cross-functional teams, consult relevant regulatory guidance, and maintain a skeptical yet objective mindset to ensure all potential risks are thoroughly considered and addressed. Question 6. Investigation of the potential impact of a new cybersecurity threat landscape on TriNet's client data protection protocols, considering both immediate vulnerabilities and long-term reputational risks. Option A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that identifies potential vulnerabilities, analyzes the likelihood and impact of various attack vectors, and prioritizes mitigation strategies based on severity and feasibility. Option B. Ignore emerging cybersecurity threats that are difficult to quantify, assuming that historical data accurately reflects future risks. Option C. Focus solely on the immediate financial costs associated with a data breach, without considering the broader implications for client trust and regulatory penalties. Option D. Rely exclusively on historical incident data to assess current cybersecurity risks, neglecting to account for evolving threat actors and attack methodologies. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that identifies potential vulnerabilities, analyzes the likelihood and impact of various attack vectors, and prioritizes mitigation strategies based on severity and feasibility. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the assessment of risk in a dynamic environment where the impact of a potential event is not immediately quantifiable, but could have significant operational and financial consequences. The challenge lies in balancing proactive risk mitigation with resource allocation, ensuring that the assessment is thorough without becoming overly speculative or paralyzing. Careful judgment is required to identify relevant risk factors, evaluate their potential impact, and determine appropriate responses within the context of TriNet's operational framework and regulatory obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of identifying potential risks, analyzing their likelihood and potential impact, and then prioritizing them based on their severity. This aligns with best professional practices in risk management, which emphasize a structured and repeatable methodology. For TriNet, This would involve considering factors such as data security breaches, regulatory noncompliance, market shifts affecting client retention, and operational disruptions. A robust risk assessment framework allows for informed decision-making regarding resource allocation for mitigation strategies, insurance, and contingency planning, thereby safeguarding the company and its clients. This approach is ethically sound as it demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and responsible business conduct, and it aligns with regulatory expectations for prudent management and operational resilience. Incorrect approach is analysis, focusing solely on immediate quantifiable risks without considering potential downstream or less obvious impacts is an incomplete approach. This failure to consider a broader spectrum of risks, such as reputational damage or long-term market erosion, can lead to unforeseen vulnerabilities, represents a regulatory and ethical failure by not exercising due diligence in identifying all material risks. Ignoring risks that are difficult to quantify, such as emerging technological threats or shifts in client sentiment, is another flawed approach. While quantification can be challenging, these risks can still have substantial consequences. This oversight constitutes a failure to adhere to the principle of comprehensive risk identification and management, potentially exposing the organization to significant harm and violating the duty of care to stakeholders. Relying exclusively on historical data without considering future trends or emerging threats is also problematic. Past performance is not always indicative of future results, and a forward-looking perspective is crucial for effective risk assessment. This approach risks regulatory noncompliance if it fails to address evolving risk landscapes and ethical shortcomings by not proactively protecting the organization and its clients from new dangers. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk assessment process that is comprehensive, forward-looking, and adaptable. This involves establishing clear criteria for risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. A key step is to involve cross-functional teams to gain diverse perspectives on potential threats. The process should be documented, regularly reviewed, and updated to reflect changes in the business environment and regulatory landscape. When faced with uncertainty, professionals should err on the side of caution, ensuring that potential impacts are thoroughly considered, even if precise quantification is difficult. This proactive and diligent approach fosters resilience and demonstrates a commitment to ethical and regulatory compliance. Question 7. What factors determine the comprehensiveness of a risk assessment for a new client data service offering? Option A. The availability of off-the-shelf security software and the general reputation of the IT department. Option B. The sensitivity of the client data involved, the applicable data protection regulations, and the potential impact of a data breach on clients and the company. Option C. The projected profitability of the new service and the company's overall marketing strategy. Option D. The speed at which the service can be launched and the perceived competitive advantage it offers. The correct answer is B. The sensitivity of the client data involved, the applicable data protection regulations, and the potential impact of a data breach on clients and the company. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in risk assessment where a company is considering a new service offering that involves handling sensitive client data. The challenge lies in balancing the potential business benefits with the inherent risks associated with data security and privacy. A thorough risk assessment is crucial to identify, analyze, and evaluate these risks before launching the service, ensuring compliance with relevant regulations and protecting both the company and its clients. The professional must exercise careful judgment to avoid overlooking critical vulnerabilities or overestimating the likelihood and impact of potential threats. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and comprehensive process of identifying potential threats to data security and privacy, assessing the likelihood of these threats occurring, and evaluating the potential impact if they do. This includes considering various risk categories such as technical vulnerabilities, human error, and external malicious attacks. The assessment should also factor in the sensitivity of the data being handled and the regulatory requirements, e.g., data protection laws, that govern its use and storage. This methodical evaluation allows for the development of appropriate mitigation strategies, controls, and contingency plans, thereby ensuring that the new service can be launched responsibly and in compliance with all applicable laws and ethical standards. This aligns with best practices in risk management and regulatory compliance, aiming to proactively manage potential issues rather than reactively addressing them after a breach occurs. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely focus on the potential revenue generated by the new service without adequately considering the associated risks. This represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure because it prioritizes profit over client protection and legal obligations. It neglects the duty of care owed to clients regarding their data and could lead to severe penalties, reputational damage, and loss of trust if a data breach occurs. Another incorrect approach is to assume that existing security measures are sufficient without conducting a specific risk assessment for the new service. This is a failure to adhere to due diligence requirements. Regulations often mandate that new initiatives undergo a tailored risk evaluation. Relying on general security protocols without specific analysis for the new data handling processes can leave critical vulnerabilities unaddressed, exposing the company to non-compliance and security incidents. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the entire risk assessment process to an external vendor without internal oversight or validation. While external expertise can be valuable, the ultimate responsibility for risk management and regulatory compliance rests with the company. This approach can lead to a superficial assessment that doesn't fully grasp the company's specific operational context or internal control environment, potentially missing crucial risks and failing to meet regulatory expectations for internal accountability. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach risk assessment by first understanding the specific context of the new initiative, including the type of data involved, the intended use, and the regulatory landscape. They should then employ a structured methodology that involves identifying all potential risks, assessing their likelihood and impact, and prioritizing them based on severity. This process should be iterative and involve input from relevant stakeholders across the organization. The outcome should be a clear understanding of the risk profile and a set of actionable mitigation strategies. Professionals must maintain a proactive stance, continuously monitoring and reviewing risks as the service evolves and the threat landscape changes, ensuring ongoing compliance and robust data protection. Question 8. When evaluating a client's financial situation to prepare a crucial report and discovering that a key piece of documentation is missing from the official client file, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure both timely completion and regulatory compliance? Option A. Follow established internal procedures to formally request the document from the client, documenting all communication and ensuring it is uploaded to the secure client file upon receipt. Option B. Immediately contact the client directly through informal channels to request the missing document, explaining the urgency. Option C. Proceed with the report using the available information, making assumptions for the missing data, and noting these assumptions in the report. Option D. Access the client's shared cloud storage or other unsecured platforms where they might have stored the document, if access credentials are known. The correct answer is B. Immediately contact the client directly through informal channels to request the missing document, explaining the urgency. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the ethical and regulatory obligations to protect client confidentiality and ensure data integrity. The TriNet hiring assessment test likely assesses an individual's understanding of compliance and best practices in a professional services context, particularly concerning sensitive client data. Careful judgment is required to navigate situations where obtaining information quickly might seem beneficial, but could lead to regulatory breaches or ethical violations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to established compliance protocols and ethical guidelines. Specifically, it upholds the principle of client confidentiality, which is a cornerstone of professional conduct and often mandated by regulations governing data handling and client relationships. By seeking authorized channels and ensuring data is handled through secure, approved methods, this approach mitigates the risk of unauthorized disclosure or data breaches, thereby protecting both the client and the firm from legal and reputational damage. This aligns with the general principles of data protection and professional responsibility expected in regulated environments. An incorrect approach that involves directly accessing client data without proper authorization or bypassing established security protocols represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could violate data privacy laws, e.g., GDPR if applicable, or specific U.S. federal/state laws depending on the exam's jurisdiction, and internal company policies designed to safeguard sensitive information. Such actions undermine client trust and can lead to severe penalties, including fines and loss of professional licenses. Another incorrect approach, such as relying on informal or unverified sources of information, fails to meet the standard of due diligence and accuracy. This can lead to decisions based on flawed data, which is professionally unacceptable and can have serious consequences for clients and the firm. It also bypasses the necessary audit trails and accountability mechanisms. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core objective, then assessing the available information and potential methods for obtaining it. Crucially, this assessment must include a thorough evaluation of the regulatory and ethical implications of each method. When faced with a choice, professionals should always default to the path that ensures compliance with all applicable laws, regulations, and ethical codes, even if it requires more time or effort. Escalating the situation to a supervisor or compliance department, when unsure, is also a critical step in responsible decision-making. Question 9. The monitoring system demonstrates a consistent pattern of minor deviations in candidate assessment scoring, which, individually, do not appear to violate the explicit thresholds set by the TriNet hiring assessment test guidelines. However, the frequency of these minor deviations is increasing across multiple assessment administrators. What is the most appropriate professional approach to address this situation? Option A. Initiate a targeted review of the assessment administrators exhibiting the highest frequency of minor deviations, analyzing their scoring methodologies, and providing additional training on the TriNet hiring assessment test scoring nuances. Option B. Dismiss the deviations as statistically insignificant noise within the system, as no single instance breaches the explicit regulatory thresholds. Option C. Immediately halt all candidate assessments and conduct a comprehensive system-wide audit of the monitoring system's algorithms to ensure accuracy. Option D. Document the increasing frequency of minor deviations in a quarterly compliance report and await further escalation from senior management before taking any action. The correct answer is A. Initiate a targeted review of the assessment administrators exhibiting the highest frequency of minor deviations, analyzing their scoring methodologies, and providing additional training on the TriNet hiring assessment test scoring nuances. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing the need for proactive risk identification with the potential for over-monitoring and resource misallocation. The compliance officer must discern genuine compliance risks from minor deviations that do not warrant significant intervention, ensuring that resources are focused on areas with the highest potential for regulatory breach or reputational damage. This requires a nuanced understanding of the TriNet hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework and its implications for hiring practices. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the monitoring system's outputs, prioritizing alerts based on their potential severity and likelihood of regulatory noncompliance. This aligns with best practices in risk management and compliance, which emphasize a risk-based approach. By focusing on significant deviations and patterns indicative of systemic issues, the compliance officer ensures that the TriNet hiring assessment test's requirements are being met effectively and efficiently, preventing minor issues from escalating into major compliance failures. This approach is ethically sound as it aims to uphold the integrity of the hiring process and adhere to the spirit and letter of the regulations governing it. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately escalating every single alert generated by the monitoring system. This demonstrates a failure to exercise professional judgment and a lack of understanding of risk prioritization. It can lead to wasted resources, alert fatigue, and a diminished capacity to address genuinely critical issues. Ethically, this approach could be seen as overly punitive and may create an environment of distrust, failing to foster a culture of continuous improvement. It also fails to comply with the implicit requirement of efficient resource allocation inherent in most regulatory frameworks. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss alerts that appear minor without further investigation. This carries the risk of overlooking subtle but significant compliance breaches that could have serious consequences. It represents a failure to conduct due diligence and a potential violation of the duty to monitor and ensure compliance with the TriNet hiring assessment test stipulations. This approach is ethically questionable as it prioritizes expediency over thoroughness, potentially exposing the organization to regulatory penalties. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on automated system flags without any human oversight or contextual analysis. While automated systems are valuable tools, they can generate false positives or misnuanced violations that require human interpretation. This approach neglects the critical role of professional judgment in compliance, potentially leading to incorrect assessments of risk and inappropriate action. It fails to meet the standard of care expected in a compliance role, which necessitates a combination of technological tools and human expertise. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a tiered approach to reviewing monitoring system outputs. This involves initial categorization of alerts based on predefined criteria e.g., severity, frequency, potential impact. For high-priority alerts, immediate investigation and action are warranted. For medium-priority alerts, further analysis and targeted review are necessary. Low-priority alerts may be logged for periodic review or trend analysis. This structured process ensures that resources are allocated effectively, risks are managed proactively, and the organization remains compliant with the TriNet hiring assessment tests requirements. It also fosters a culture of accountability and continuous improvement within the compliance function. Question 10. Quality control measures reveal a pattern of minor discrepancies in client onboarding documentation, leading to a slight delay in meeting internal service level agreements for account activation. These discrepancies are not currently triggering any automated compliance alerts. What is the most appropriate best practice approach to address this situation? Option A. Conduct a thorough root cause analysis involving the onboarding, compliance, and IT departments to identify process or system failures, and implement targeted corrective actions to prevent future discrepancies. Option B. Classify the discrepancies as minor operational noise and accept them as a necessary trade-off for achieving faster client onboarding times. Option C. Immediately retrain all staff involved in the onboarding process on documentation requirements and issue warnings to those who have contributed to the discrepancies. Option D. Focus on expediting the account activation process to meet SLAs and address the documentation discrepancies only if they escalate to trigger automated compliance alerts. Correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough root cause analysis involving the onboarding, compliance, and IT departments to identify process or system failures, and implement targeted corrective actions to prevent future discrepancies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing the need for efficient service delivery with the regulatory imperative to ensure accurate and compliant record-keeping. The pressure to meet service-level agreements, SLAs, can create a temptation to cut corners on documentation, which, if not managed, can lead to significant compliance risks. The professional challenge lies in identifying and rectifying systemic issues that compromise data integrity and regulatory adherence without disrupting essential business operations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, root cause analysis of the identified discrepancies. This demonstrates a commitment to understanding why the errors are occurring, rather than just addressing the symptoms. By involving relevant departments and implementing corrective actions that address the underlying processes, this approach upholds the principle of know your customer, KIC, and data accuracy, which are fundamental to regulatory compliance in the financial services sector. This proactive and systematic method ensures that future transactions are more likely to be compliant, thereby mitigating risks of fines, reputational damage, and operational inefficiencies. It aligns with the ethical duty to act with integrity and diligence. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on immediate remediation of the current errors without investigating the cause. This is a reactive measure that fails to prevent future occurrences, leading to a recurring problem and continued compliance risk. It suggests a lack of commitment to systemic improvement and may be seen as a superficial attempt to address a deeper issue, potentially violating the spirit of regulatory oversight, which demands robust internal controls. Another incorrect approach involves blaming individual employees for the discrepancies. While individual accountability is important, this approach overlooks potential systemic flaws in training, technology, or process design. Focusing solely on individuals without addressing the root cause is an ineffective management practice and can foster a culture of fear rather than a culture of continuous improvement and compliance. It fails to meet the regulatory expectation of establishing and maintaining effective systems and controls. A third incorrect approach is to dismiss the discrepancies as minor and statistically insignificant, especially if they do not immediately trigger a red flag in automated systems. This approach is dangerous as it ignores the cumulative impact of small errors and the potential for them to mask more serious compliance breaches. It demonstrates a disregard for the principle of thoroughness and due diligence required by regulators, potentially leading to significant penalties if discovered during an audit. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing a systematic and evidence-based investigation. The decision-making process should involve 1. Acknowledging the issue and its potential impact. 2. Initiating a comprehensive review to identify the root cause, not just the symptoms. 3. Collaborating with all affected parties to develop and implement sustainable corrective actions. 4. Establishing ongoing monitoring to ensure the effectiveness of the implemented changes. This structured approach ensures that compliance is embedded within operational processes rather than being an afterthought. Question 11. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of increased trading activity in a specific client account that deviates from its historical profile, raising a potential red flag for market abuse. Option A. Initiate a detailed review of the client's recent trading activity, including the rationale for specific trades, relevant client communications, and the client's overall risk profile, to ascertain the nature and intent of the activity. Option B. Dismiss the alert as a system anomaly, assuming the client's generally good standing negates any potential compliance concerns. Option C. Immediately report the client for potential market abuse and recommend account suspension based solely on the monitoring system's alert. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive audit of all client accounts to identify similar patterns, without prioritizing the specific flagged account. The correct answer is A. Initiate a detailed review of the client's recent trading activity, including the rationale for specific trades, relevant client communications, and the client's overall risk profile, to ascertain the nature and intent of the activity. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing the need for proactive risk identification with the potential for overregulation or misinterpretation of data. The monitoring system has flagged a pattern that could indicate a compliance issue, but it's not definitive. The professional challenge lies in determining the appropriate level of investigation and action without causing undue disruption or making premature judgments. This requires a nuanced understanding of the firm's risk appetite, regulatory expectations, and the specific context of the flagged activity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted review that begins with a deeper dive into the specific transactions and client interactions. This includes examining the underlying rationale for the trades, reviewing client communications, and assessing the client's overall profile against the firm's policies. This method aligns with best practices by seeking to understand the context and intent behind the flagged activity before escalating or taking punitive action. It demonstrates a commitment to thoroughness and fairness, ensuring that actions are based on a comprehensive understanding of the facts, thereby adhering to principles of due diligence and responsible oversight, as expected under regulatory frameworks that emphasize a risk-based approach to compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately escalating the flagged activity for disciplinary action without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge that monitoring systems can generate false positives and that context is crucial. It represents a failure in due diligence and could lead to unfair sanctions against clients or employees, potentially violating principles of natural justice and good governance. It also demonstrates a lack of understanding of risk assessment, treating a potential indicator as conclusive proof of wrongdoing. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the flag entirely based on a superficial review of the client's general standing. This ignores the specific pattern identified by the monitoring system, which is designed to detect deviations from normal behavior or established risk parameters. Such an approach risks overlooking genuine compliance breaches, which would be a direct failure to meet regulatory obligations for robust monitoring and supervision. It prioritizes convenience over diligent oversight. A third incorrect approach is to conduct a broad, unfocused review of all client activity, rather than concentrating on the specific pattern identified. While thoroughness is important, an indiscriminate approach can be inefficient and may dilute the focus on the actual area of concern. This can lead to wasted resources and a failure to identify the root cause of the flagged activity, potentially missing critical compliance risks. It also fails to demonstrate a targeted and effective risk management strategy. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the nature of the alert and the capabilities of the monitoring system. The next step is to gather more specific information related to the alert, focusing on the context and rationale. This involves consulting relevant policies, procedures, and client documentation. If the initial review suggests a potential issue, a more in-depth investigation should be initiated, involving relevant stakeholders such as compliance officers or legal counsel. The decision-making process should be guided by a commitment to fairness, accuracy, and adherence to regulatory requirements, always seeking to understand the why behind the data before taking action. Question 12. What factors determine the effectiveness of TriNet's regulatory compliance program in managing client payroll and tax obligations under U.S. federal and state laws? Option A. The reliance on client-provided information for tax filings without independent verification by TriNet. Option B. The assumption that historical compliance procedures remain adequate without periodic review or adaptation to new regulations. Option C. The prioritization of cost reduction in compliance departments through reduced training and outdated technology. Option D. The extent to which TriNet proactively monitors regulatory changes, implements robust internal controls for data accuracy, and conducts regular audits of its compliance processes. Correct answer is D. The extent to which TriNet proactively monitors regulatory changes, implements robust internal controls for data accuracy, and conducts regular audits of its compliance processes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because TriNet, as a professional employer organization, PO, operates under specific regulatory frameworks that govern its responsibilities in managing payroll, benefits, and HR functions for its clients. Ensuring compliance with these regulations, particularly regarding the accurate classification of workers and the proper remittance of taxes, is paramount. A failure in this area can lead to significant financial penalties, legal liabilities for both TriNet and its clients, and damage to TriNet's reputation. The complexity arises from the need to stay abreast of evolving tax laws and employment regulation across different states and federal jurisdictions, and to implement robust internal controls to prevent errors. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes proactive and continuous monitoring of regulatory changes and the implementation of robust internal controls. This aligns with the fundamental principles of regulatory compliance, which require organizations to not only understand, but also actively adapt to legal and regulatory requirements. For a PEO like TriNet, this means establishing clear processes for worker classification, ensuring accurate tax withholding and remittance based on current federal and state laws, and maintaining comprehensive documentation. This approach demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and risk mitigation, which is essential for maintaining client trust and avoiding regulatory sanctions. It reflects best professional practice by prioritizing accuracy, compliance, and client protection. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on client self-reporting without independent verification. This fails to acknowledge TriNet's responsibility as a PEO to ensure the accuracy of the services it provides. Relying entirely on client input without internal checks creates a significant risk of noncompliance due to potential client errors or misunderstandings of complex tax laws. This approach represents a regulatory failure by abdicating a core responsibility and an ethical failure by not adequately safeguarding client interests. Another incorrect approach prioritizes cost-cutting over compliance by reducing investment in compliance training and technology. Regulatory compliance is not merely an operational expense, but a critical business imperative. Underinvesting in this area directly increases the risk of errors, leading to potential fines, penalties, and legal disputes, which ultimately incur far greater costs. This approach demonstrates a severe lack of professional judgment and a disregard for the legal and ethical obligations associated with operating as a PEO. A third incorrect approach involves assuming that past compliance practices are sufficient for future operations without periodic review. Regulatory landscapes are dynamic, with frequent updates to tax laws, employment regulations, and reporting requirements. A static approach to compliance is inherently flawed and will inevitably lead to outdated practices and potential noncompliance. This represents a failure to adapt to the evolving regulatory environment and a lack of proactive risk management. Professional reasoning. Professionals in regulatory compliance roles should adopt a proactive and systematic approach. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the applicable regulatory framework, in this case, U.S. federal and state employment and tax laws relevant to PEOs. 2. Establishing clear policies and procedures that are regularly reviewed and updated. 3. Implementing robust internal controls and audit mechanisms to ensure adherence to policies and regulations. 4. Investing in ongoing training for staff on regulatory changes and best practices. 5. Utilizing technology to automate compliance processes where possible and to monitor for potential issues. 6. Maintaining open communication with clients regarding their responsibilities and TriNet's compliance efforts. This structured approach ensures that compliance is integrated into daily operations and is not treated as an afterthought. Question 13. Process analysis reveals that a new client's onboarding process for their new hires is experiencing delays due to the time it takes for HR representatives to manually input all employee data into TriNet's system. One HR representative suggests using a personal spreadsheet to pre-compile and organize the data before entering it into TriNet's platform, believing this will significantly speed up the process. Option A. The HR representative should be encouraged to develop a custom script to automate data entry from their personal spreadsheet directly into TriNet's system to maximize efficiency. Option B. The HR representative should be instructed to use only TriNet's designated secure platforms for all data compilation and entry, ensuring all information is verified for accuracy and completeness before final submission, even if it takes longer. Option C. The HR representative should be advised to prioritize speed and enter the data as quickly as possible into TriNet's system, and address any inaccuracies or missing information later. Option D. The HR representative should be allowed to use their personal spreadsheet to pre-compile data, as long as they promise to be careful and delete the spreadsheet after entering the data into TriNet's system. Correct answer is B. The HR representative should be instructed to use only TriNet's designated secure platforms for all data compilation and entry, ensuring all information is verified for accuracy and completeness before final submission, even if it takes longer. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in ensuring compliance with TriNet's internal policies and relevant employment laws, specifically concerning the handling of employee data and the process of onboarding new hires. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for efficient onboarding with the absolute requirement to protect sensitive personal information and adhere to legal mandates regarding data privacy and accuracy. Careful judgment is required to avoid both operational bottlenecks and regulatory breaches. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, compliant, and secure method for collecting and verifying employee information. This involves utilizing TriNet's designated secure platforms and ensuring all data entry is accurate and complete before final submission. This aligns with TriNet's commitment to data integrity and client confidentiality, and implicitly with regulatory frameworks that mandate secure data handling and accurate record-keeping for employment purposes. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to the employee's privacy and the client's trust. An incorrect approach that bypasses secure platforms for expediency fails to uphold data security standards, potentially exposing sensitive information to unauthorized access or loss, which is a direct violation of data protection principles and TriNet's security protocols. Another incorrect approach that relies on incomplete or unverified information introduces inaccuracies into employee records. This can lead to compliance issues with tax authorities, benefits providers, and other regulatory bodies, as well as potential legal liabilities for TriNet and its clients. It also undermines the integrity of the HR and payroll functions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the established procedures and regulatory requirements. When faced with a situation that seems to offer a shortcut, the first step is to assess if the shortcut compromises any established policy or legal obligation. If there is any doubt, consulting internal compliance resources or supervisors is paramount. The decision should always favor a compliant and secure process, even if it requires slightly more time, over a faster but potentially non-compliant or insecure method. This proactive approach prevents errors and minimizes risk. Question 14. The efficiency study reveals that certain administrative tasks within TriNet's client onboarding process are time-consuming and could potentially be streamlined. A proposal suggests consolidating these tasks into a single, automated workflow, which is projected to reduce labor costs by 15%. However, this consolidation would require employees to handle significantly higher volume of complex data entry and verification within a shorter time frame, potentially impacting accuracy and employee satisfaction. Which of the following represents the most professionally sound approach to evaluating and implementing this proposed change? Option A. Delegate the decision-making authority to the IT department to implement the automation, assuming they have the technical expertise to manage the transition effectively. Option B. Implement the automated workflow immediately to realize the projected cost savings, with a plan to address any employee concerns or accuracy issues that arise post-implementation. Option C. Conduct a pilot program of the automated workflow with a small, representative group of employees, gathering detailed feedback on workload, accuracy, and system usability before a full rollout. Option D. Reject the proposal outright due to the potential for increased employee workload and the risk of accuracy issues, prioritizing the current operational model. The correct answer is B. Implement the automated workflow immediately to realize the projected cost savings, with a plan to address any employee concerns or accuracy issues that arise post-implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for cost reduction with the long-term implications of employee morale, productivity, and adherence to TriNet's operational guidelines and implied service level agreements. A hasty decision without proper consideration of the impact on the workforce can lead to decreased service quality, increased turnover, and potential compliance issues if the new processes are not adequately documented or trained. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, data-driven, and employee-centric evaluation. This involves a thorough assessment of the proposed changes, including pilot testing, gathering feedback from affected employees, and ensuring that any new processes align with TriNet's commitment to efficient and compliant service delivery. This methodical approach minimizes disruption, fosters employee buy-in, and safeguards against unforeseen negative consequences, thereby upholding TriNet's reputation and operational integrity. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost savings without considering the impact on employee workload or the quality of service provided would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to burnout, errors in client service, and a decline in overall operational efficiency, potentially violating implicit service standards and negatively impacting client satisfaction. Another incorrect approach, such as implementing changes without proper training or communication, would fail to ensure that employees can effectively adapt to new procedures, leading to confusion, reduced productivity, and increased risk of non-compliance with internal policies and external regulations governing TriNet's operations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the problem and objectives. This is followed by identifying and evaluating potential solutions, considering their impact on all stakeholders, including employees, clients, and the organization. A critical step involves risk assessment and mitigation planning. For this scenario, the framework would involve gathering data, consulting with relevant departments, e.g., HR, operations, conducting pilot programs, and establishing clear communication channels before any widespread implementation. This iterative process ensures that decisions are informed, justifiable, and aligned with best practices and regulatory expectations. Question 15. Operational review demonstrates that the onboarding team is consistently facing pressure to expedite the hiring process for new employees, leading to instances where the verification of employment eligibility documents for Form I-9 is being completed after the employee has already begun working, and in some cases, with incomplete documentation due to perceived time constraints. Option A. Accept digital copies of identification and work authorization documents submitted via email without requiring a review of original documents, as this streamlines the process and is generally accepted by most clients. Option B. Implement a grace period for Form I-9 completion, allowing employees up to 5 business days after their start date to submit all necessary documentation, and rely on verbal assurances from hiring managers for initial verification. Option C. Delegate the primary responsibility for ensuring the accuracy and timely completion of Form I-9 to the new hire, with minimal oversight from TriNet's HR department, assuming new hires are aware of their legal obligations. Option D. Immediately halt the expedited onboarding process and reinforce the mandatory requirement to complete Form I-9 verification on or before the employee's first day of employment, ensuring all required documentation is reviewed and retained according to IRCA guidelines and TriNet's internal policies. The correct answer is D. Immediately halt the expedited onboarding process and reinforce the mandatory requirement to complete Form I-9 verification on or before the employee's first day of employment, ensuring all required documentation is reviewed and retained according to IRCA guidelines and TriNet's internal policies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing operational efficiency with the absolute priority of adhering to TriNet's internal compliance policies and relevant U.S. federal and state employment laws. The pressure to onboard new employees quickly can lead to shortcuts, but any deviation from established procedures, especially concerning the verification of employment eligibility, carries significant legal and financial risks for both TriNet and its clients. The core challenge lies in recognizing that speed cannot supersede accuracy and legal compliance in critical HR processes. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a thorough and documented review of all required employment eligibility verification documents, even if it introduces a slight delay. This aligns with the Immigration Reform and Control Act (IRCA) of 1986, which mandates that employers complete and retain Form I-9 for every individual hired. The law requires employers to examine original documents presented by the employee to verify identity and employment authorization. A systematic, policy-driven approach ensures that all legal requirements are met, minimizing the risk of penalties for noncompliance, which can include fines and even criminal charges. This also upholds TriNet's commitment to providing compliant HR services to its clients. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that bypasses the standard document verification process for expediency, even with a verbal assurance from the hiring manager, is a direct violation of IRCA and TriNet's internal policies. This creates a significant legal liability for improper I-9 completion, which can result in substantial fines per form. It also exposes TriNet and its clients to risks associated with employing unauthorized workers. Another incorrect approach would be to accept photocopies of documents without a proper process for verifying their authenticity or requesting original documents when required. IRCA specifies the types of documents that are acceptable and the employer's responsibility to examine them. Relying solely on photocopies without further validation is insufficient and can lead to penalties. Finally, an approach that defers the I-9 completion entirely to the employee without adequate oversight or a clear deadline for submission, while seemingly empowering the employee, can still result in noncompliance if the employee fails to complete it correctly or on time. The ultimate responsibility for ensuring the I-9 is properly completed and retained rests with the employer, TriNet in this case, acting as the employer of record for its clients. Professional reasoning. When faced with operational pressures that conflict with compliance requirements, professionals must first identify the governing regulations and internal policies. The absolute priority is always legal and ethical compliance. The decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the specific legal mandates, e.g., IRCA for I-9. 2. Reviewing internal policies and procedures designed to meet these mandates. 3. Assessing the risks associated with any proposed deviation from policy. 4. Prioritizing compliance over speed or perceived efficiency. 5. Communicating any potential delays or challenges to stakeholders, explaining the necessity for compliance. In this context, any action that compromises the integrity of the I-9 process is unacceptable. Question 16. System analysis indicates a need to integrate a new third-party analytics tool to enhance the evaluation of applicant data for the TriNet hiring assessment test. This tool promises advanced insights, but requires access to sensitive applicant information. What is the most appropriate approach to ensure compliance with data protection regulations and maintain the integrity of the hiring process during this integration? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive security and compliance audit of the third-party tool, followed by a pilot integration using anonymized or de-identified data before full deployment. Option B. Proceed with the integration directly into the live applicant database, relying on the vendor's assurances of their tool's compliance and security measures. Option C. Integrate the tool after a brief review of the vendor's marketing materials, assuming their product meets all necessary regulatory standards. Option D. Implement the tool immediately into the live applicant database, without any prior auditing or pilot testing, to gain immediate analytical benefits. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive security and compliance audit of the third-party tool, followed by a pilot integration using anonymized or de-identified data before full deployment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in a regulated environment, balancing the need for efficient data processing with the stringent requirements for data privacy and security mandated by the TriNet hiring assessment tests governing regulations. The challenge lies in identifying and mitigating potential vulnerabilities introduced during the integration of a new third-party analytics tool without compromising the integrity or confidentiality of sensitive applicant data. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance while still leveraging technological advancements. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased, risk-based integration strategy. This begins with a thorough security and compliance audit of the third-party tool, focusing on its data handling practices, encryption protocols, and adherence to relevant data protection laws. Subsequently, a pilot program with anonymized or de-identified data should be conducted to test the tool's functionality and identify any unforeseen data leakage or access issues. This methodical approach ensures that potential risks are identified and addressed before full deployment, aligning with the regulatory imperative to protect applicant data and maintain the integrity of the hiring process. It reflects best professional practice by prioritizing compliance and security through proactive risk management. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing the tool without a prior security and compliance audit is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a disregard for data protection laws, potentially exposing sensitive applicant information to unauthorized access or misuse. This approach bypasses essential due diligence, creating a high risk of data breaches and subsequent legal repercussions. Integrating the tool directly into the live applicant database without a pilot phase using anonymized data is another critical failure. This exposes live, sensitive applicant information to potential vulnerabilities inherent in a new, unproven integration. It violates the principle of least privilege and the duty to protect confidential information, leading to potential privacy violations and erosion of trust. Relying solely on the vendor's assurances of compliance without independent verification is professionally negligent. While vendor representations are a starting point, regulatory frameworks often require an organization to conduct its own due diligence and ensure that third-party tools meet specific compliance standards. This approach outsources critical compliance responsibilities, which is not permissible under most regulatory regimes. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such implementation challenges should adopt a structured, risk-aware decision-making process. This involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory requirements governing data handling and privacy within the context of the TriNet hiring assessment test. 2. Conducting thorough due diligence on any third-party tools, including security audits and compliance assessments. 3. Implementing a phased rollout strategy, starting with controlled environments, e.g., pilot programs with de-identified data before full deployment. 4. Establishing clear data governance policies and procedures for the use of new tools. 5. Maintaining ongoing monitoring and review of the tool's performance and compliance post-implementation. This systematic approach ensures that technological advancements are adopted responsibly, safeguarding both the organization and the individuals whose data is being processed. Question 17. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new applicant tracking system for TriNet will significantly reduce administrative overhead and speed up the hiring process. However, the proposed system's data retention policies are not fully aligned with current employment law guidelines regarding candidate data privacy. What is the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the proposed system's data retention policies against all relevant employment laws and data privacy regulations, and only proceed if compliance gaps can be rectified or are deemed negligible. Option B. Prioritize the cost savings and efficiency gains, and assume that minor deviations from data privacy guidelines will not attract regulatory attention. Option C. Halt the implementation entirely due to the identified data privacy concerns, regardless of the potential cost benefits. Option D. Proceed with the implementation, but initiate a separate project to address data privacy compliance issues post-launch. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the implementation, but initiate a separate project to address data privacy compliance issues post-launch. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial benefits of a proposed system upgrade against the potential long-term risks and compliance obligations. The TriNet hiring assessment test, in its operational context, likely involves handling sensitive employee data and adhering to various employment and data privacy regulations. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that any implementation, even one with clear cost savings, does not inadvertently create compliance gaps or introduce new vulnerabilities that could lead to regulatory penalties or reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to assess not just the financial return, but also the operational and legal implications. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough risk assessment and compliance review before committing to the implementation. This aligns with the principles of responsible data handling and regulatory adherence, which are paramount in any system involving employee information. By proactively identifying potential compliance issues and integrating them into the decision-making process, the organization demonstrates a commitment to operating within the bounds of applicable laws and ethical standards. This approach mitigates future risks and ensures that the cost-benefit analysis is comprehensive, accounting for potential costs associated with noncompliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the immediate cost savings without adequate due diligence on compliance fails to uphold professional standards. This could lead to regulatory violations, such as breaches of data privacy laws or employment regulations, resulting in fines, legal action, and damage to the company's reputation. Another incorrect approach that delays the compliance review until after implementation is equally problematic. This reactive stance increases the likelihood of discovering significant compliance issues late in the process, potentially requiring costly rework or even a complete rollback of the implemented system, thereby negating the initial cost savings and introducing operational disruption. Furthermore, ignoring potential ethical implications of data handling, even if not explicitly illegal, can erode trust with employees and stakeholders. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that integrates risk management and compliance into every stage of a project, especially those involving technology and data. This involves 1. Clearly defining project objectives and scope. 2. Conducting a comprehensive risk assessment, including legal, regulatory, and ethical considerations. 3. Engaging relevant stakeholders, including legal and compliance departments early in the process. 4. Developing mitigation strategies for identified risks. 5. Ensuring that the final decision reflects a holistic view of costs, benefits, and risks, with compliance being a non-negotiable factor. Question 18. The audit findings indicate a pattern of inconsistent completion and retention of Form I-9 documentation by the Human Resources Department, raising concerns about compliance with federal employment eligibility verification requirements. Which of the following represents the most effective and compliant approach to address these findings? Option A. Implement a mandatory, comprehensive retraining program for all HR personnel on Form I-9 procedures, emphasizing the importance of accurate documentation and timely completion, coupled with a revised internal audit schedule to review a random sample of I-9 forms quarterly. Option B. Develop a new policy that allows HR staff to exercise discretion in accepting alternative forms of identification if original documents are unavailable. To expedite the onboarding process, Option C. Conduct a one-time, in-depth review of all existing Form I-9 records to identify and correct any past errors, and then revert to the previous onboarding procedures. Option D. Immediately cease all new employee onboarding until a complete overhaul of the HR department's understanding of immigration law is achieved, potentially delaying critical hiring processes. Correct answer is A. Implement a mandatory, comprehensive retraining program for all HR personnel on Form I-9 procedures, emphasizing the importance of accurate documentation and timely completion, coupled with a revised internal audit schedule to review a random sample of I-9 forms quarterly. Explanation: the audit findings indicate a potential breakdown in the internal controls surrounding the processing of new employee onboarding documentation, specifically concerning the verification of Form I-9 documentation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts compliance with federal immigration law, specifically the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, IRCA, which mandates employers verify the identity and employment authorization of all individuals hired in the United States. The complexity arises from the need to balance efficient onboarding with rigorous adherence to legal requirements, ensuring no discrimination occurs while maintaining accurate records. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the existing onboarding process, identifying specific control weaknesses, and implementing targeted corrective actions. This includes retraining HR personnel on the precise requirements of Form I-9 completion and acceptable documentation, establishing a robust system for periodic internal audits of I-9 forms, and developing clear protocols for addressing discrepancies or missing information. This represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the identified audit findings, mitigates legal risk by ensuring compliance with IRCA, and upholds ethical obligations to both employees and the government. It demonstrates a commitment to a strong compliance culture and proactive risk management. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on a blanket retraining of all employees without identifying specific control gaps is professionally unacceptable. This is because it is inefficient, potentially overlooks the root cause of the problem, and may not adequately address the specific procedural failures identified by the audit. It fails to demonstrate a targeted and effective remediation strategy. Another incorrect approach, such as simply discarding incomplete I-9 forms without proper documentation or follow-up, is a severe regulatory and ethical failure. This action directly violates IRCA record-keeping requirements and could lead to significant penalties. It also exposes the company to accusations of discriminatory practices if such actions are not applied uniformly and consistently. A third incorrect approach, relying solely on external legal counsel to review all I-9s without improving internal processes, is also problematic. While legal review is important, it is a reactive measure. It does not build internal capacity or address systemic control weaknesses, making the company perpetually reliant on external resources and failing to foster a culture of compliance within the organization. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the precise nature of the audit findings and the underlying regulatory requirements. This involves a detailed analysis of the process, identification of specific control failures, and a risk-based assessment of potential consequences. The decision-making process should then focus on developing a remediation plan that is both compliant and practical, prioritizing actions that directly address the identified risks and strengthen internal controls. Continuous monitoring and periodic reassessment are crucial to ensure the effectiveness of implemented solutions. Question 19. Strategic planning requires a company facing increased operational costs to evaluate its current hiring assessment process. The goal is to identify potential cost-saving measures without compromising the integrity or compliance of the hiring process. Which of the following represents the most prudent and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Outsource the entire assessment function to the lowest bidding third-party vendor without conducting thorough due diligence on their compliance with relevant employment laws and data privacy regulations. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the current hiring assessment tools and processes, consulting with legal counsel and HR experts to identify compliant and cost-effective alternatives or optimizations that align with the TriNet hiring assessment test framework. Option C. Reduce the number of assessment stages in the hiring process to expedite candidate throughput and lower associated costs, without evaluating the impact on candidate quality or compliance. Option D. Immediately replace the existing assessment platform with a significantly cheaper, unvetted online tool to achieve immediate cost savings, assuming it covers basic candidate screening. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the current hiring assessment tools and processes, consulting with legal counsel and HR experts to identify compliant and cost-effective alternatives or optimizations that align with the TriNet hiring assessment test framework. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for cost savings with the long-term implications of compliance and employee well-being, all within the specific regulatory framework of the TriNet hiring assessment test. The company is facing pressure to reduce operational expenses, which often leads to exploring options that might seem attractive on the surface, but carry significant risks if not implemented carefully and in accordance with applicable laws and best practices. The core of the challenge lies in identifying a solution that is both financially prudent and legally sound, without compromising the integrity of the hiring process or the company's ethical obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, compliant, and ethical review before making any significant changes. This involves understanding the full scope of the TriNet hiring assessment test's requirements, including any specific regulations or guidelines that govern its use, particularly concerning data privacy, fairness, and the validity of assessments. By engaging legal counsel and HR experts, the company ensures that any proposed changes are vetted against these requirements. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of regulatory violations, potential litigation, and damage to the company's reputation. It also demonstrates a commitment to fair hiring practices, which is crucial for attracting and retaining quality talent. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction, without considering the regulatory implications, would be professionally unacceptable. For instance, unilaterally deciding to discontinue certain assessment components or switch to a less expensive, unvetted alternative without a proper review could violate principles of fair employment practices and potentially specific regulations related to hiring assessments. This could lead to claims of discrimination if the new process is not validated or if it disproportionately impacts certain protected groups. Another incorrect approach might involve outsourcing the assessment process to a vendor without conducting due diligence on the vendor's compliance with relevant laws, such as data security and privacy regulations. This could expose the company to significant liability if the vendor mishandles sensitive candidate data or uses non-compliant assessment tools. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the problem and its objectives, followed by a comprehensive assessment of potential solutions. This assessment must include a rigorous evaluation of each option against legal, ethical, and operational requirements. When considering changes to hiring processes, it is essential to consult with subject matter experts, including legal counsel and HR professionals, to ensure full compliance. A phased implementation with pilot testing and ongoing monitoring is also a best practice to identify and address any unforeseen issues before full rollout. Question 20. Market research demonstrates a growing demand for enhanced compliance features within hiring assessment platforms. TriNet is developing a new module designed to automatically flag potential discriminatory language in job descriptions. What is the most prudent approach to ensure this new module is fully compliant with U.S. federal and state employment laws before its widespread release? Option A. Focus testing efforts primarily on the user interface and ease of use, with a cursory review of compliance features. Option B. Rely on the module's internal logic, assuming it reflects standard best practices for avoiding discriminatory language, and proceed with a full launch. Option C. Conduct thorough legal and compliance reviews of the module's algorithms and output against all relevant U.S. federal and state employment laws, followed by a phased rollout with ongoing monitoring. Option D. Deploy the module immediately to a small group of beta testers and address any reported compliance issues as they arise. Correct answer is C. Conduct thorough legal and compliance reviews of the module's algorithms and output against all relevant U.S. federal and state employment laws, followed by a phased rollout with ongoing monitoring. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in the TriNet hiring assessment test context, specifically concerning the integration of a new compliance module. The challenge lies in balancing the need for rapid deployment to meet business objectives with the imperative of ensuring the new module fully adheres to all relevant U.S. federal and state employment laws, as well as TriNet's internal ethical guidelines. Misinterpreting or overlooking specific regulatory nuances can lead to significant legal repercussions, reputational damage, and operational inefficiencies. The pressure to deliver quickly can tempt teams to cut corners, making rigorous validation and testing paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased rollout of the compliance module, preceded by comprehensive testing and validation against all applicable U.S. employment regulations. This includes, but is not limited to, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title Roman VII, the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA), the Age Discrimination in Employment Act (ADEA), and relevant state-specific employment laws. This approach ensures that the module's functionality, data handling, and reporting mechanisms are not only technically sound, but also legally compliant before impacting a wider user base. It demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing legal and ethical integrity, mitigating risk, and building trust with both internal stakeholders and external clients. This methodical process allows for early identification and correction of any compliance gaps, preventing potential violations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to deploy the module immediately to all users without prior validation, relying solely on post-deployment feedback to identify issues. This represents a severe regulatory failure, as it exposes TriNet and its clients to potential violations of employment laws from the outset. It disregards the proactive compliance requirements mandated by regulatory bodies and ethical standards, which emphasize preventing harm rather than reacting to it. Another incorrect approach is to conduct only superficial testing, focusing primarily on user interface and basic functionality, while neglecting in-depth review of the module's compliance logic against specific legal requirements. This is ethically unsound and legally risky, as it creates a false sense of security. It fails to uphold the duty of care to ensure that hiring processes facilitated by TriNet's platform are fair and non-discriminatory, potentially leading to disparate impact claims or other legal challenges. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of implementation over thoroughness, making assumptions about regulatory compliance based on similar existing modules. This is a dangerous practice that ignores the unique requirements and potential pitfalls of the new module. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to the principle of know your product from a compliance perspective, which is a cornerstone of responsible business operations in the regulated financial services industry. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such implementation challenges should adopt a risk-based approach. This involves identifying all potential regulatory and ethical risks associated with the new module, prioritizing them based on severity and likelihood, and developing mitigation strategies. A structured testing and validation framework, incorporating legal and compliance expertise, is essential. Regular communication with stakeholders, including legal counsel and compliance officers, throughout the development and deployment lifecycle is crucial. When in doubt, it is always best to err on the side of caution and seek expert advice to ensure full adherence to all applicable laws and ethical standards.